Hello and welcome to Access Chat. We're delighted to welcome back David Baines. Dave has been on the show multiple times.
It's been a
We're
while.
recording this show just after M-enabling, so Dave and I are in different hotel rooms in DC just to make sure that the rumors don't start. So Dave, welcome back. Tell us a little bit about what you're up to right now, because you've been doing all sorts of things around the world. What are you up to right now?
So the main thing I'm working on is as chairperson of the Equitable AI Alliance, which is a Zero Project and Seneca Trust initiative, exploring the impact of AI on the lives of people with disabilities. Alongside that, other things that I'm working on various projects in Europe. We've been doing a project with AI for global symbols on creating symbols for communication using a generative AI to develop wider vocabulary and language and cultural appropriate symbols for different communities. And then the normal mishmash of things that one does as a consultant.
Excellent. And we're all friends of Zero Project here, and have been a, let's say, minor contributor to the Equitable AI Alliance.
Mm.
I think that we'd like to do more in that space in the coming year, and that's something that I've talked to Zero about. But can you explain a little bit more about some of the things that the Alliance is trying to do in terms of getting the disability topics onto the agenda at some of these sort of discussions that are happening about AI?
Yeah. So, the Alliance was established, Neil, really to explore both the opportunities that artificial intelligence offers, but also to look at how we mitigate and address some of the risks and challenges that are implicit and explicit in AI for people with disabilities. And the Alliance is quite a wide, diverse set of stakeholders. So it includes some of the technology companies such as Atos, but also Microsoft and Google. It includes disabled persons organizations, World Blind Union, Deaf and G3ACT, but also researchers, consultants, and academics working in the field. And what we really wanted to try to do was, one, as I say, was to amplify the opportunities, the things that are actually happening with AI now, make people aware of the many, many benefits that AI is bringing, but also to break out of the disability diversity circuit of events, conferences, and stakeholders, really to try and raise the issue within other communities. So that includes technology and AI conferences, but also sectorial, such as education, employment, health, independent living conferences, and to place people with lived experience and their allies into those events. We've diversified that a little bit more recently. So we're now running our own webinars, which are attracting quite a wide audience, but also looking to place speakers and guests with podcasts and video conferencing videocasts, both in terms of the disability community to build capacity within the sector, but again, outside of our echo chamber to where we can have greater influence.
Yeah. So whether it be AI or other topics, that mainstreaming and taking the sort of disability lived experience knowledge and the accessibility practitioner knowledge to some of these mainstream conferences has always been something that has been somewhat of a challenge and has been something, and a topic that we all here have discussed as something that's been needed for a long time. So are we? I think I've seen a couple of instances where we've managed to insert people onto the agenda of some of the mainstream conferences. What are some of the target conferences that you would really like to see the disability community being able to have a voice at?
Some of the big ones we've been successful at have been things like Mobile World Congress, and we had speakers at Super AI in Singapore. But it is quite challenging to get into those major events. Probably disability and inclusion is not high on the agenda. But I have to say that I would say that that's equally true. We've also spoken at some diversity, equality, and inclusion events. And even at those, quite often The disability perspective is really quite low on the agenda amongst speakers. Other diversity issues are much higher profile. And I don't think that's changed for a number of years. So again, really trying to push that forward. So we're going to be at Open Educa Berlin, which is a mainstream education event in Berlin. We just recently spoken at GCPR, which is a mainstream health event full of doctors and health professionals, but not specifically disability professionals, much more wide health professionals.
We know that some of those tech conferences are sponsored by known vendors that care about accessibility and care about disability. Could they be a mean of access to those conferences to bring the topic up?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that is always really important is introductions by people to the conferences. That helps us establish our credibility and encourage people to think, yeah, we can provide high quality speakers who will be engaging for your audience. So one of the things that we ask people to do is that if they have a good contact in a major conference, wherever it is in the world, this is a global perspective, please make an introduction for us and we can follow that up. That ambassadorial role, if you like, from our huge community makes a big difference in terms of us being heard at an early stage in the planning of conferences.
David, I know you're not feeling very good. Thank you so much for joining us when you're not feeling very well. So I just want to do
Thank
that
you.
for the audience. But I was looking up the Equitable AI Alliance and I actually found another one that's focused on education. I know the California education system and San Diego University created something called the Equitable AI Alliance, EAIA. So I want to make sure the audience knows that's going to be different, even though we appreciate these universities stepping up because AI is going to change everything. And one thing we want to do is make sure that we humans are involved in, what it's going to do. But I think it's interesting. And I was looking at the people, it's very Western focused, but you do have a couple of, I know you have somebody from Kenya and somebody from Austria, for example, but how will you make sure that more of the voices are heard, not from the Western countries, even though we got lots to say still in the Western countries? And also, how do you make sure that you don't confuse it with other initiatives like this California one, focused on education? But I think it's a win for everybody no matter what. But I was just curious, how is that going to work? Because there are a lot of people from our community talking about, I don't know if a lot is the right word, but there is efforts being made. I also want to say one more thing. When you were making the comment about, as usual, when we're talking about diversity, even though that's a really weird word in the United States right now, DEI and woke, but regardless, often when we were in those conversations, disability wasn't included or was barely included. But I think also I want to say something that I'm thinking about when I'm talking about AI right now is it is truly about human inclusion. It's not about diversity and DEI. It is truly about why would you build any technology that doesn't include humans at every single phase of our lives, any way that we can, facilitate as a human being. I think it's illogical. I just want to put that out there. But I was just curious about a few of those things. Excuse me
Yeah,
if I...
let's remember them. So yeah, absolutely. We're very aware that the San Diego Alliance and we wish them
Yeah,
well. I think, they come up when I search. So my advice, if anybody who's searching for us, is to look for Zero Project, Equitable AI Alliance, but also join our LinkedIn Disability Inclusive AI group. That's also a very good way, and that is separate from just searching for the Alliance. And we're just over 1,000 members of the LinkedIn group at the moment, and it's quite active. So that would certainly be one way of getting round some of that barrier. The diversity issue is an interesting one, and I think it's interesting. One, I've always been quite struck by the work of Jutta Treviranus for many, many years, for many, many reasons. But I do think the point that she has made for some time, what AI generally does is it looks for the median, it looks for the average. And what it tends to do is exclude what she calls the outliers, the things that don't quite fit the pattern. And I think the point that she's made, which I think I would really talk to developers about, is start from those outliers. If you build to include the outliers, you include everybody in your planning. That might affect your weighting, it might affect the data set, but it also, I think, in terms of the algorithms that you're writing, making sure that you're not excluding, if you like, idiosyncratic data as you search and interpret it is quite important. I think the questions of discrimination and bias are complex. Let's take AI, which is being used specifically designed for people with disabilities. And to be honest, there isn't really a great deal of discrimination and bias in those tools. We're seeing more and more assistive technologies having AI elements built in. So this is why we think there's a lot to be learned from that experience. Where we have a problem, to some extent, is where we have mainstream tools that should be inclusive. But even here, I think the scenario is a little more complex. If I ask any of the big tools, Copilot, Gemini, ChatGPT, about disability, most of what it gives back to me is quite reasonable. It's not particularly biased or discriminatory. It draws from quite a wide, large language models and so on, and it gives me good answers. What are the best ways to support people with disability employment? Any one of those will give you some pretty good, accurate information. Where we start to hit a problem is when we become domain specific. And the classic one that everybody talks about, and quite rightly, is in employment and recruitment, where the data of a person is misinterpreted by the AI because it doesn't fit the normal pattern, whether it's facial disfiguration, whether it's not giving eye contact or speech patterns and so on. But we can see those same patterns beginning to emerge and being problematic in other areas. AI in education would be a really good example where people's interviews to enter higher education will encounter exactly the same questions as employment, but also problems engaging students' work. What's the place of AI in it? How do we measure students' work when it's being written with various forms of AT, including AT that encompasses AI? So these are things that we're beginning to struggle with, but it's where the AI is being honed down. It's being made more specific, both generative AI and agentic AI and conversational AI and so on. So these are all really quite big issues and challenges, but it does begin to focus our attention a little bit on where the biggest single problems are. One of the things that we were talking about a little bit here about enabling as well as the data and in the interrogation of that data, is transparency. Transparency of what is in your data set, but also transparency of what's often referred to as chain of thought. So how did the AI get from the data to an answer? What's the chain of thought that it employs? And if we understand transparency in that chain of thought and how it's doing it, then we begin to see whether or not there are issues in that chain of thought that are creating bias and discrimination also. So lots of things to think about.
So, David, don't you think that the quality of data that we are getting is somehow a mirror of the areas in which we achieve progress and the areas where we haven't achieved that progress?
So as I said, I think data about disability, I think, is quite widely available. As I say, when we look at those mainstream things about disability and people talking about disability, that's fine. We have this interesting challenge around privacy and knowing whether the data includes people with disabilities. So here's a problem for the data. If we treat all data as anonymized and private, how do we know which data represents people with disabilities? All they are is outliers. They're the oddities. They don't fit the mainstream pattern. They don't fit the average. And that's why they get excluded. Many, many people that I talk to with disabilities recognize the huge potential that AI brings. And they do bring a slightly different perspective to privacy as a result. But as we move into more and more policy around AI regulation, it might be that we're actually creating a challenge in knowing whether data sets have got data from people with disabilities included, because we can't identify them. They're anonymized. So I think for policymakers, this is an interesting problem. And I'm sure it's not the only outlier group that this is true of.
Mm-hmm.
We know whether or not the data that's included is men or women or whatever, if it's all been anonymized.
Yeah, I think that this is a dilemma that's been around for a long time. Like, we had really quite fierce debates about browser sniffing for AT to try and work out the intent of the developer is that they wish to help improve an experience, but at the same time, many people don't wish their disability status to be known or disclosed. I was struck at the conference by the keynote on, I think, the first day from Meta's lead around accessibility, and they had the glasses on, and they were showing what a wonderful potential it had as an assistive technology. And I thought, this is great. I'm never going to use it because I don't trust having Mark Zuckerberg on my face, because you don't have that transparency and that explanation of the train of thought and all of the rest of the stuff. I think the other thing that you don't have is, and I do sometimes give away my data because I understand that I'm making an exchange of my personal data for something that is more valuable for me. But I think that people are extremely cautious now because of what's happening in geopolitics, where you can give your data to one organization and it can transfer to another. And a good example of this has been me. The gene sequencing startup that everybody was really interested. I'm going to find out about where I came from and my ancestry and all of these things. They go bankrupt. The data that people thought they'd given to a company that was going to keep that secure is now free on the open market. So I think that it is something that requires really significant thought about how we handle this and how we can ensure that people that do give that data away aren't at a later date potentially making themselves vulnerable because of some of the things that are going on in society right now.
Yeah, I do agree. I think fundamentally, data protection principles should be sufficient for AI data. One of the problems is that most of us give up data without actually reading what it could be used for. And the terms and conditions feel sometimes, if they're deliberately written, to make sure that you don't read them.
Of course.
One of the nice things you can do if you're thinking about one of these things, and which I would advocate for, and I've told many people with disabilities to do so, actually stick the terms and conditions into ChatGPT or similar and ask it to tell you the key points. Create an easy read version for me. If the developer, the manufacturer or vendor hasn't done so, we can use AI to give us that feedback and understand what it might be used for. Easy read is actually quite good in some of these. But I think the interesting problem we have, and it is an interesting problem, if we don't allow our data to be used as people with disabilities, the AI cannot get better.
True.
It can only learn from the information we let it use. That's one challenge. I think the second challenge, you touch upon it there, Neil, is what is the balance point for different groups in society? The balance between benefit and risk may be quite different for some people with disabilities than it is to others. And I think the genetic one is an interesting one because actually there's an thing. If you have a history of genetic conditions in your family and you put it through a gene sequencing system and the DNA checks and so on, yes, you may find out some of those things as well as your family history and so on. Where did I come from? But that might, as you say, then end up in the hands of insurance companies and so on, who may then choose to deny you access to healthcare and health insurance because you're high risk. What does that mean for people with disabilities? What is the balance of risk and benefit there? In that, if they're applying for health insurance, if they have a disability, they probably already have to declare that when they're making those health applications. So that actually the risk may actually for them be slightly less than it is for other people. But finding that balance, not for the entire population, but for different sectors of the population, is even more challenging when we have all of these different dimensions and weightings to take into account.
David, I know that we want to be thoughtful and not keep you on air too much, but I want to ask you a really, really hard question.
Thank you.
These are really hard questions, but first of all, I want to start by saying I appreciate the collaboration that I see coming from the Equitable AI Alliance, only because I believe that the only way moving forward is for more of us to collaborate. So I appreciate, that you are collaborating. I look forward to seeing even more diversity in what you are doing, but I know that's what you are working on. But this is why I'm glad that you are there and other groups are there as well, because this is really complicated. So, David, this is a question I have. How do we get AI right when we as society don't even know how to do this ourselves? Society doesn't know how to include the outliers. We know how to technologically make sure that all digital, all technology is accessible. We know how to do that as society, and yet we don't. And so I think I told this story on the air already, so I apologize to the audience if I did, but we were playing a little Google game. It was just a little silly Google game. And what it was is that Google would take a picture, a little app, it would take a picture of me and it would trash talk me. Oh, your hair is so white, and sort of insult me a little bit, but in good natured stuff. So I took a picture of me and it trashed me, and others in the room did. And then I took a picture of Sarah, my daughter with Down syndrome, and the app came back and said, it is not appropriate to be making fun of people with disabilities. It's really, and I actually got a big lecture from Google about not making fun of my daughter with Down syndrome, but my daughter had actually wanted to play the game too. And so I loved Google that they were so thoughtful about it, but my daughter wanted to anyway. So it's such a slippery slope. And so you see these, just giving some love to Google, you see Google trying to get it right. How in the world do we get this right when we don't know how to get it right in society? But by the way, let's make sure we get it right with AI. I just was saying, thank y'all for coming together to explore these things.
One of the big problems with AI is it can amplify existing problems because of the way in which it filters data. I think that the humor one is a really interesting problem. And we've seen a growth of comedians with disabilities. There is an interesting, subtle difference between laughing with people and laughing at people.
Correct.
That gets even more complex when comedians are laughing at themselves. So, how do we work our way through that and so on? I think that one of the biggest problems is defining what we mean by right. I think there's some underlying principles which I think are important. The first one is transparency. I think, regardless of what else we think is right, transparency is an underlying principle that I think is something which can be applied through the chain of developing AI. I think the other principle which I would apply in terms of people with disabilities is co-design. It's not just about taking their information. It's not just about asking them to do testing. It's actually about involving them through the entire process of development. And we've known that in other areas of technology. AT companies have been co-designing for most of their businesses.
Sure.
So I think that co-design for AI, engaging the outliers in that design from the beginning, is also very, very helpful. But I think there's another problem as we go forward, which is global perspectives. That concept of what is right and wrong and how we both feel about disability as well as other issues varies according to where in the world we are and culture and so on. What do we mean by independence? As you know, I spent a long time in the Middle East, and independence for people with disability was almost always framed as being independence within the family, which is very different to what is often discussed in the West, which is how do you get away from your family and live in a flat by yourself? So there are lots of concepts that are culturally charged. And I think when we look at data and that concept of co-design and what is right, we need to understand there isn't one single answer to that question.
Absolutely. It's far more nuanced and far more varied.
Mm-hmm.
David, thank you so much for coming and doing this when you're feeling a little unwell. We really appreciate you sharing the work with us and like the feedback from the community, I think, is super important. I think that the last few days, it was really a live discussion at the M-Enabling conference.
And I think one of the things that I think Deborah touched upon, it was this need for cooperation and collaboration.
Absolutely.
So if people come to our Equitable AI Alliance website, one of the things they'll find there is our resource hub. So what we've been doing is gathering resources that other people have written and developed and pulling them into a single resource hub that you can use to help build capacity within the disability community to both inform people with disabilities about the issues, but also advocate for what needs to be done for the future, what we believe can be done to improve AI. And that's freely available and openly available to anybody that wants to use it. If people want to know more, we would really say, Chris, if you want us to organize perhaps a webinar for a business, a company, an organization, we would be very happy to do so, to go into the issues a bit more depth within a specific context. And join us online, both in terms of the LinkedIn group, but also join us for some of the webinars we're going to run, which will be done in partnerships with others. Our next one will be with you, Trevor Anius, and we will be talking about practical steps to implement inclusive and accessible AI.
That's fantastic. And I need to mark my diary for that one because I'm a huge fan.
I'll email you.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you so much, David. It's been a real pleasure. Thanks to Amazon for continuing to support us. And we look forward to continuing this work in partnership together.
Likewise. Take care, everybody.